Good afternoon. I'm Faye Coleman. I'm with the DC Black Power Chronicles Oral History Project, and I'm delighted to have Miss Koko Barnes Ladson here for an interview. And we're going to talk about the role that she played in the community as an activist, as a SNCC veteran, and the work that she's continuing to do. She's made a tremendous contribution to the Black community in the District of Columbia and elsewhere. So welcome, Koko, and thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Of course.
I want to start by sort of at the beginning to ask you to tell us a little bit about the early years as a child growing up. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that you were born and raised in Newport News, Virginia. Is that correct?
Well, that's what I accept, but I was physically born in North Carolina.
That's right. Okay.
My mom and dad were from North Carolina. They married as youngsters, and I was the last of three to my mother.
Okay.
And she was going home to have all her babies and coming back to Newport News.
Okay.
So the family was living in Newport News, but I was born in North Carolina, Maxton, where Afena Shakur was born.
Okay.
And after 3 months, she moved me back with the family in Newport News, and I lived in Newport News the rest of the time.
I see. So tell us a little bit about the community that you lived in. What was it like at that time? Your neighbors, your siblings, and what role your parents played in the early years of your formative years?
Well, I don't have a lot of memories. I don't know why, but I don't. But I was, as I said, the youngest of three. My brother, James, we call him Tank McQueen. My sister, Ella McQueen. And at that time, I was Lil Jean McQueen. I was always small in stature. And my father was an entrepreneur. He, by trade, worked at the waterfront, as they called it, which was the shipyard in Newport News. At that time, it was the largest shipbuilding and dry dock company in the world, and it kept that title for many years until Norfolk built up right across the water. Anyway, I grew up feeling loved and doing things that most kids did, but because I was the youngest of three, I always wanted to know and to do what they were doing. So I started driving cars at the age of 7. They weren't, but I wanted to try to have a leg up on them. Our school, I went to the same high school as the girls in Hidden Figures.
Really?
Yes.
So what was that like? That was George Washington Carver?
George Washington
High
Carver.
School?
We have a historical marker on the highway, Jefferson Avenue, our main drag. Even now, it was erected last year because so many people of note went to that school, and the school played quite a pivotal part in the community. The Global Girls, there was license taken in the making of the movie, but in '61, when they say that's when the movie took place, they graduated that year. They were in my sister's class. Joylette, the oldest, was in my brother's class, and I shared a class with them because I was in the orchestra, and we all were in the orchestra. But you know, we were at the Goebel's house and that kind of thing. And the thing that really is important for me, even bringing that up, is as important as Mrs. Goebel was at that time at Langley Field, she was as active in the community, you know, receiving children, encouraging them. Fortunately, my family was an advanced family in terms of us and grades and that kind of thing. But still, we were encouraged I was encouraged to be an aeronautical engineer. In fact, my high school yearbook says, you know, what are you going to be? Aeronautical engineer.
Interesting.
Yes.
So was there back in those days, was there a focus on STEM, and how did that interest in aeronautical engineering, where did that come from, do you think?
Well, I'm sure it came from of Miss Goebel's
Influence.
influence in her work at Langley Field, which was right up the street from us. Though I grew up in Newport News, the Hampton dividing line was just a few blocks away from us, and Langley Field was just up the road. But I think it came from, at that time, Carver, it was before pre-integration.
Yeah, sure.
Our school had an advanced class, the senior class. Well, I think it started before senior class. My memory isn't good there, but in the senior class, I was with the advanced group, academic group, and we went to Hampton Institute at the time, not Hampton University,
Right.
For our work, advanced math, science,
This is when you were still in high school.
still in high school. At that time, Virginia had a law that you had to have 5 years of PE. So our last year in school, we had to have PE. So we took our school bus to Hampton, took classes at Hampton during the day, and then came back to our school in the evening and took PE, and then went home on the bus with everybody else.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about your earliest recollections of racial injustice during those years, maybe high school or even earlier. What were some of the things that seemed to stick out for you?
Well, of course, the most troubling was Emmett Till's murder, the tragic and horrific murder of Emmett Till, a 15-year-old from Chicago, going back to his roots in Mississippi, visiting that summer. And at that time, it didn't come out, but since then, it's all come out that it was a lie. He never did anything that he was accused of having done. But the accusation was that he whistled at a white woman, and Virginia was strictly anti-black at that time. And he was caught and beat to death and hung by some white men who, anyway. And of course the papers had it. I can't really remember about TV at the time.
Yeah, it was
I know
in the mid-50s.
we had. I know we had television.
Yeah.
Anyway, it just was horrific. And my dad, being in the public as he was, and also at working in sort of an international setting at the shipyard, people from all over the country interacting with them. It was definitely a topic of conversation, and it was terrifying to me. But my mom, our house, what we did was always a refuge. If you had any problems, you could come to the McQueens. If you didn't have shoes, my mom would buy you shoes. You know, we had the corner store, Joe's Corner, my dad, Joseph McQueen, and we sold, just like any corner store, canned foods and shelf food, as I call it, but we also had fresh meats. And so, you know, you could come there and get food and pay us later on the books, as we say. So I was in contact with the whole community at a very early age.
Was there something about incidents like the Emmett Till murder? And I think when we talked earlier, you had mentioned something about a gentleman who was electrocuted because his wife was white.
Girlfriend. He didn't even marry her. Yes, that was the Bunch family. Our store, they lived directly across the street from our store, our corner store, and we got to know that family very well, obviously. They were always speaking to us in the store, whatever. But Linwood Bunch was his name, and this was just a few years later, and he was alleged to have been dating this white girl, and he was caught. And at that time, if you were dating, getting ready to get married, or whatever your level of relationship is, if you get caught, you just say rape, so that you are cleared, because the stigma and the accusation sticks. And he was electrocuted for dating this white girl.
And was no trial, no.
They did have a trial. He was found guilty because the laws at that time, the miscegenation laws at the time was, that's what it said. In fact, There was an article in the Washington Post this week about the man in Virginia who was most noted for making sure there was no mixing of the race. I don't want to dignify him with his name, but his actions for working as hard as he could, he didn't believe he believed that if you had one drop of black blood in you, you were worthless and not worthy to be represented by anything that the government offered. So the biggest thing that he did was to keep Native Americans from being recognized and receiving any kind of compensation that the government was giving to tribes in recognizing tribes. He wouldn't do that. And there was someone also in Maryland as well. But anyway, the laws were very clear. Very clear.
So as you started experiencing, at least hearing about these and knowing these people, in the case of the gentleman who was a neighbor of yours who was electrocuted, how did you begin to, you obviously had feelings that engendered feelings about racial injustice and all in this country, what was going on in this country. How did you process that, and how did you act on that as those feelings and your feelings of rage or whatever as you were getting older?
I'm not sure that I acted on it as I was getting older in a conscious way, because my family was a pivotal family in the community, and we were always interacting with the community and helping. And also, there weren't white people in our community. It was pre-integration, so you only saw black people. Even our police officers were black. Everybody that we came in contact with were black. Now, of course, my dad, owning a store, his suppliers were not black. So we did come in contact with white people, but on a daily basis, in my going to school, getting on the bus, going to school, leaving school, coming back to the store, on the weekends, going to the movies or whatever, the beaches even. There was just a string across the river, and one side was black and one side was white. Same water, but there was no mixing of the races. So it wasn't something like, I have friends who grew up further south. DC was where you change, when the trains came through, you got out and you got in the black only car. When you were coming north, south, and when you were going north from the south,
you changed back
and got in the black only car. So DC was a little different, and by Virginia being I guess a bordering state of DC, some of those things were more liberal than elsewhere. But most of my friends talked about how when they were going to school in the morning, they had to get off the sidewalk if white kids were walking and give them the sidewalk, and then they could get back on. Or if there was ever any dispute, the white kids were always in the right. I didn't experience any of that. We grew up knowing who we were and that we were great, proud people. We could do anything we wanted to do. And I really grew up thinking that I could. I was never challenged, but I grew up thinking it wasn't a question. You just had to do your work, learn your craft, and work your craft. So it was that kind of confidence, full confidence, with which I approached life for myself.
Interesting. So when you got to Howard, you came to Howard in the early 60s, I believe it was 63. You were a student in engineering. Was it an engineering? An engineering major or physics?
Physics, double math and physics
Math
major.
and physics major. So what were your first impressions? Obviously there was a lot going on at Howard, and different from, I would assume, from Newport News. So what were your first impressions of Howard?
Well, to be honest, the very first real impression I got was on the main campus, the student group called NAG,
Okay. Do you remember what that?
Nonviolent Action Group,
Okay.
which in many ways was the precursor to SNCC.
Okay.
But it didn't go from NAG to SNCC, but the people in them, did that same kind of work. But they were organizing, collecting foods and clothing to take to Mississippi for the 64 summer
64 Drive.
Yeah. And you know, people know how. Anyway, so I was always active in the community, doing things, and so I immediately got involved with NAG, and that's through that organization I met Stokely and a few of the SNCC leaders, and saw a role or saw my place in that kind of activity. And from there, I joined other groups, local organizations, and eventually 14th Street was a long way from where I was living because I moved off campus my second year, and eventually found my way to 14th Street where they were organizing this organization called the New School for Afro-American Thought. And Gaston Neal, may he rest in peace, and Don Freeman were the major organizers of it. And my friend Vera Walston at the time, and I said, you know, we may as well get involved and help with this organizing effort. And we did. We helped to organize the New School physically because it was built. The interior was fitted out, as well as organizing people to come and to take part. The whole idea of the New School was to bring consciousness into the community, let people, black people know that there are things they could do. This is in 66, I believe.
It was 60, I think it was 66, around there,
And also to bring speakers. Everybody came through the New School. Malcolm X, everybody came through the New School. Leroy Jones at that time, who later became Amiri Baraka. John Carlos and Tommy Smith, after they did the Black Power salute at the Olympics, they came through because it was our cultural center. It was our center for consciousness and organizing the community. And it was on 14th Street. The SNCC office wasn't on 14th Street at that time. When they moved to 14th Street, they moved diagonal across the street from the New School. And Vera and I went over there to see how we could be helpful there or they could be helpful to us. And Baba Zulu, that time Lester McKinney, was heading the office. But it was also by this time the year that Stokely issued the call for Black Power.
That was 66.
Willie Ricks, of course, is the person that articulated the phrase Black Power at this particular rally at which Stokely was speaking. But he embraced it and continued it. Stokely got the credit, but
it was really Willie Ricks who did the first uttering of that phrase, Black Power.
Yeah. Absolutely it was. And Stokely, of course, got the credit, but DC was just bubbling with activity at that time for black people. And as I said, if you came to DC, you came through the New School. And I remember Chuck Stone, he was a writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, was special assistant to Adam Clayton Powell. He really energized us. He was always helpful, always bringing information, giving us ideas, and pointing us in certain directions. A lot of work went on at the New School, a lot of people.
So tell me, was the New School also called Ujamaa Sule? Or
No.
What was the connection, or if any, between?
There was no direct connection
Okay.
that I know of. My role never had anything to do with the Ujamaa until, in fact, Ujamaa, I saw Ujamaa as an outgrowth of our SNCC Freedom School.
Okay. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, because when the children in DC started wearing afros, I would think as a direct influence from some of the things going on in that corridor with the New School and with SNCC, they were being expelled. And so we would hold classes in the afternoon. I would organize a place in the students, and there was a group of, there were two sisters in particular, the Coffee sisters we call them, Mary and Marty Coffee. They are, may they rest in peace. one of their sons is a doctor, and the other son is, they're still in the area. But they helped us. They helped to provide tutoring. They were school teachers for the students who were expelled and who had to keep their lessons up. So I and Vera and others Alberta Crow was an early student. Vera's sister, Jolynn Brooks, was one of the early students in our SNCC Freedom School. And Baba Zulu, being the head of the SNCC office, even after Stokely came, it was the SNCC office's project. It wasn't my project, but I was the person doing it. So they started a preschool called Ujamaa over at Florida, 9th in Florida. And they operated from there for a few years, and then they moved to their current location at 15th and Q Northwest. And they've been there ever since. So they're the oldest, longest standing independent school in DC that I'm aware of.
And those were the roots that came from the DC SNCC office. It's one of as the Freedom School, and this was a offshoot of that. Yeah,
that's my recollection.
Yeah,
yes.
Interesting. So let me ask you, how did you happen to become Stokely's executive assistant?
Well,
and when was that? Do you recall?
It was shortly after he arrived in the office, because he was now the chairman of SNCC.
Right.
And he had a lot of extra, I would imagine, call on him from the community, from country, around the country. And he saw or heard of or knew of my administrative skills. Being child of this entrepreneur, I had a lot of skills because
I
organized everything for my dad. I did his taxes, I did his inventory, I did everything for his businesses, kept his businesses in order. And so much so, as I think about it, the largest hardware store in Hampton, very nearby where we lived, was liquidating, going out of business, sort of like the Heckinger situation. And they brought in this nationwide liquidator, and they had this ad in the paper for, some help. And I applied because I was going to be a senior next year, leaving, and I was getting more and more responsibility, but more and more leisure, freedom to move around. And I applied to go over there and work that summer before my last year. And Mr., his name will come to me, but the liquidator, I don't know what I was doing or what he observed when he observed me, asked me would I be his special assistant. And we got that place organized, and we got that we got that sale going on, and he was out of there. But that was my first job outside of my parents' businesses. And I realized then that I did have some marketable skills. And so I guess other people saw it wherever I was. I was articulate, I could write, I could speak, I could research, in fact, I did some ghost writing for Stokely.
Right, the book, I came across this I'm in the process of cleaning out some files and all, and it's The Pitfalls of Liberalism. You were telling, because I noticed your name. It says copyright Stokely's mother, Mabel Carmichael, written January 1969, exclusive distribution by Koko. I said, okay, let me bring this and show you. Yeah,
that was one of them. That was one of them. He traveled so much,
right?
And he was gone a lot. And Ebony Johnson Publication had a contract with him to record his speeches. Okay. I don't know what's going to come of that with all of these people from the 60s, their work getting taken down or whatever. But he did have a contract with Johnson Publication, and they taped most of his speeches. But anyway, he was so busy. He traveled so much. So a lot of it, he would just say, Koko, you know, put something together and make a pamphlet for this, or send some, answer these letters for me. So I answered his correspondence. Some of it he never saw. He just trusted me to do it. And much of it he saw. I would get him to sign. But that was one of them, yes.
Yeah. So, did you have an opportunity to travel with him? I know you also work closely with other SNCC veterans like Chico Neblett, and we already mentioned Rick Cleves-Sellers, some of the others. Did you travel around, or were you basically in the DC SNCC office and then the DC area?
I was basically in the DC SNCC office in the DC area. However, I did travel with him on several occasions. For an example, towards the end of the existence of the SNCC office, there was this merger with the Black Panther Party, and Stokely was the prime minister. And as prime minister, and as my being his executive assistant, that gave me responsibilities because most of the stuff I knew he wasn't going to be doing if it was of an administrative nature. So I did a lot of organizing offices on the East Coast, training. I trained Afeni and her group in New York, Panther office. I went with him to Minnesota the night he made his famous speech about
anti-Zionism.
Anti-Zionism, yes.
Yeah, that was so controversial at the time.
Yeah,
as
in
was
fact,
most of the things that he said.
Yeah, in fact, it really began the demise of the SNCC office because so many of the supporters were Jewish people. And to his defense, it got painted as an anti-Jewish position, but it was not anti-Jewish because Semites have a history with African people.
Right.
You know, that's what they are. So that's not anything that we would be against, but it was some politics. But of course, that's how it came out. So I was with him then, and I traveled with him to California for the Panthers, for Huey's trial. Huey P. Newton, the head of the Black Panther Party, and 4 or 5 kind of trips like that, but not a lot.
So what was that period of the merger between SNCC and the Panthers? You were sort of a front row observer to all of that. This was the time when the Panthers were very active in the community with their free breakfast, all of the programs that they were in, of course, all the controversy. So how was that with you, and what sort of, how did that impact your feelings about nationalism and, you know, black power and all?
Well, I have to admit that I was not making a connection at that time. You kind of do. You kind of perform. You kind of bring out of you who you are for the task at hand. And for an example, in organizing the offices or establishing the offices, in training the sisters primarily who were manning the phones or whatever, you would go into a professional stance, an administrative stance. You wouldn't get into the politics of it because things just happened so fast, and there was so much to do. But because J. Edgar Hoover, who at that time was the head of the FBI, began to step up his opposition to anything black and any organization black, having said that he didn't want a black messiah to rise after the Malcolms and the Kings. They really tracked me and had agents following me all the time, and not just me. It was many of us.
Yeah, I remember when folks came to Boston, and I was involved in some. I'll never forget the time the FBI came to my house, and I wasn't there. They talked to my father and said, "Do you know what kind of people your daughter is
Hanging
out with?" It was you and Chico and
Yes.
a lot of SNCC and Black Panther
Yes.
folks.
Yes.
So, how did that era though influence your beliefs?
Well, prior to that era, let me say, I worked, UPO opened, United Planning Organization, in 65. I believe it was 65. And it was called, it was the anti-poverty program to address the ills in the community. I'm not saying that's what they said, but, and they hired a lot of professional organizers, and I was one of them, and next thing I knew, I looked around, there were so many SNCC organizers in it. There was this white guy named Al McShirley, who, I don't know if he's in jail now, but he hasn't stopped, and they haven't stopped haunting him. But he formed this organization called ACCESS, ACCESS, standing for Action Coordinating Committee to End Segregation in the Suburbs. This was when the white flight was going on, and all the white people were leaving DC, moving to the suburbs. And they built the Beltway to give them easy access to get back and forth home, in a word. And he organized a march around the Beltway to symbolize this noose, that's what he called it, around the city of Washington. And I looked up, and many of my UPO friends were part of the organization. And we marched around the Beltway, we did, and we got bottles thrown at us and fruit thrown at us and that kind of thing in '66. But UPO was an interesting phenomenon because it was like, we now can organize in our communities. That's not what, I think we were supposed to be cooling people, but we were educating people. For example, we opened the Prince George's office called the, what was it called? The Suburban Program.
Okay.
And we rented offices above a famous landmark called Jack's Liquors, next door to a famous landmark called Ebony Inn, and anyone in this area would know them. And we had the second floor over Jack's. It was a loan office there, and we had the second floor. And we were right in the middle of the community. We did voter registration, not from the office, but in the community. Voter education. In fact, Fairmont Heights is where it was, right across the DC line, Eastern Avenue in Northeast, Sheriff Road. Gladys Noon Spellman, who at that time was a council person in Prince George's County, was doing a tour through the area and broke the heel on her shoe. And she said, we're going to pave these roads. And they got paved. That's the kind of nothing going on to support the aspirations of black people, that the condition at the time. And we helped to support that, argue for it, keep the pressure on until it happened, and it happened, yes. We registered people, whatever it was that they felt that their community needed, we supported their aspirations. I don't know what happened to the suburban program because I resigned and worked full-time at SNCC as Stokely's assistant, but those 60s were a time of so much
was going on.
Yes.
I know you also were instrumental in the Black United Front, which had a major impact in the community at that time. Talk a little bit about that.
It's interesting because it's just an organizing, result of organizing. Stokely at the time was calling for the black leaders to come together, to not just talk, but talk on a platform that asked for and supported the same things that each needed. Good schools. Barbara Sizemore, it was the era of Barbara Sizemore. I even ran for the school board to support her aspirations and what she wanted to do and to keep her on the board. I lost by, I think it was 10 or 100. I forget the number, but I lost by a few votes. But at that time, there was Sterling Tucker, Walter Fauntleroy, the head, UDC had, at that time was called Federal City College.
Yeah.
Harlan Randolph was the head of it. And you had Douglas Moore,
Oh, yeah.
several, Dave Eaton, the leaders, quote, leaders of the community at that time. And Stokely felt it was important that we just not have leaders who talk about their corners of the world, but that we could find some corners that all of us felt and were affected by, and that we could come up with some platforms to demand or ask for from the authorities that we needed, and then to ask the community to support those platforms as well. And it worked very well. Their first call for a Black United Front, all the leaders came, but Stokely's admission to them was, nobody's going to hold a press conference when this meeting is over and say what happened. This is our community, this is our meeting, and there'll be no press releases. You can say it was spirited, a lot was accomplished, whatever, but no report of the meeting. And it worked for a long time.
Oh, it did.
Yes, there were no reports of the meeting, but what happened was a young black boy got shot by a policeman whose name was White. So the white policeman, black boy, was even back in those days, you know, what's happening now, white policemen and black boys and men and women. And it kind of changed the dynamic some, because you know, the cameras and the microphones were going in front of the leaders, you know, asking their opinion, because the people took to the streets and complained and gave voice to what happened. But it was a great experiment, and it opened up other cities to have a Black United Front.
I remember also you had a major role with the Commission for Racial Justice and the United Church of Christ. Talk a little bit about how did you get involved, and what sort of things were you all involved trying to accomplish in those days?
Well, the SNCC office closed in '69, and Dr. Charles Cobb, rest his soul, just a giant among men. He was United Church of Christ minister, one of the leaders of the black ministers at that time. In fact, Jeremiah Wright was not a minister at the time. He was a board member of the United Church of Christ. I mean, of the Commission for Racial Justice. The church established this commission, and Charles Cobb was hired to do the groundwork for the commission.
Charles Cobb Sr.,
Senior.
whose son,
whose
was
son
very instrumental in SNCC, and
absolutely.
was a SNCC veteran,
and he had to get it from his dad, because his dad
yeah.
was just phenomenal, just phenomenal. In fact, he was the one that convinced the church to get the Wilmington 10, to get involved in the Wilmington 10 case, to get that
Ben
exposed
Chavis.
for what it was, and then to get Ben Chavis released from jail. Of course, Reverend Ben Chavis went on to become
the
head of the NAACP.
Right, and well, before that, the Commission for Racial Justice.
He came to head the local office. I was the director in his stead, and when he came back, he took over the directorship, yes. So I cross-pollinated with a lot of the early things in DC that mattered. For example, Blacks in Government, big. I remember Nell Pendleton. The names just escaped me. The early organizers of it.
Of Blacks in Government.
We would meet with them. We would talk with them. We would strategize with them, support their whatever the aspiration was, whatever the activity was.
Was this in the 60s, or
that was more in the 70s?
In the
Let's
70s,
go back before the 60s ended. Dr. Cobb, in fact, in '69, when SNCC office closes, when they asked me to find a location, to have a local office, a local presence. And I said that I would, but that at that time did I get pregnant? Yeah, pregnant. Probably that January. And I said, when I have the baby, we can move forward, move in, and I became I wasn't the director of the office, but I was the organizer in the office. And we, for an example, many things came out of that office. I started a third-party custody program at Lorton, and I named it after some youth that I had become acquainted with that were in Lorton. And we call it YANG, Y-A-N-G, Youth Against Narcotics. Gee, I can't believe I can't think of all the letters. Y-A-N-G. Anyway, and it was the first third-party custody program there where we got about 12 inmates released to me 5 days a week to come into the community for education and service in the community.
And so your role was they would come to you, report to you, and you assign them to projects in the community?
Yes.
And then do they go back to
Yes,
Lorton?
they went back to Lorton in the evening.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, dare to live, dare to believe, live your convictions, and then you're not afraid. You don't think something is wrong because it's what you believe. You believe you're right. Everybody's on your side because you got to be on the side of righteousness. I'm not going to get into the church with this, but United Church of Christ was footing the bill for this, and they fully supported. As I said, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who is a reverend now, who wasn't then, was a board member. And the board members, T. Willie Fair, who has been head of the Urban League in Miami, Florida for over 50 years, was a board member. Dr. Sharon, Edmonds.
Oh, okay.
Karen
father,
Edmonds.
Yeah.
Yes.
Her father was the
chairman of the board.
Exactly.
For the United Church of Christ. And Dr. Edmonds was a firebrand then. I see where Karen gets it from. My goodness. Karen Edmonds, but she's no longer Edmonds.
Yes.
But the roots of survival, the roots of knowing who you are, the roots of being committed, the roots of organization were all over DC. Yes, at the time. And I won't forget that the United Church of Christ, at the time, I was director for programs and director for programs on Africa and director for community organizations. And I joined the Council of Churches of Greater Washington. At that time, Reverend Greater Washington, and he assigned me to the Social Action Committee.
Okay.
And as a Social Action chairperson, I could organize churches around social issues, and each church could choose to or not to have an event or an activity around those issues. Well, at that time in the early 70s, and I know I've jumped from 60s.
That's okay.
The South Africa,
Freedom
for South Africa was the hottest thing on the ticket
for
us. And we meaning the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, held the first anti-apartheid national conference.
I was going to ask about that conference.
Yes, we held it right here in DC. And Damu Smith was my executive assistant on that. And he helped to...
May he rest in peace.
May he rest in peace. Thank you. Damu was wonderful.
He was a wonderful.
Oh, yes, he was.
So authentic.
Talented. Just always on it. Always on it. So he was my right hand, and I was fortunate to have him because I don't think we would have had the success that we did had we not had him. But DC was the first city to vote to divest from any, to not do business with any company that did business in South Africa. And I don't want to go too far into that, but I believe, and I'll go on record as saying it, that this whole thing of releasing Nelson from prison had its genesis in South Africa needing to have those sanctions lifted.
Absolutely.
Because they were dying.
Well, you know, a lot of the early activities that really got a lot of attention nationally emanated right here. Eleanor Holmes Norton and Mary Frances Berry, you know, out protesting
Randall
Robinson outside the South African embassy.
Absolutely.
And
my children were arrested
Sylvia
doing
Hill,
that.
all of them, yeah.
Oh, Dr. Sylvia Hill.
Yeah.
In fact, we had a coalition with Dr. Sylvia Hill's ASP, SASP, South African Support Project, SASP. And through SASP, again, we had a coalition with SASP. As a member, I helped to collect medical supplies to be sent to the front lines for the Southern African freedom fighters. That time, you had Zimbabwe up in arms, you had Angola up in arms, you had Mozambique up in arms. Just an aside, and I won't stay on this too long, but I went to Zimbabwe, first year of independence, and the medical supplies that came out of DC that the independent school children and others collected and sent, I had the pleasure of opening that box and opening up supplies coming from DC, and I saw my daughter's box because she was in independent school at the time. And that just made me feel wonderful because you give money, you send stuff, you don't know if it ever gets to the people to whom it's intended. You don't know if it gets used in the way it's supposed to be. So it just, when I saw that, because I helped her to make the box. We made a first aid kit, put hinges on it, little Red Cross, and it just did my heart good. But anyway, I worked in the Ministry of Health, and we opened that box.
That was 1980.
Yeah, I've left the 70s already.
That's okay. You mentioned.
Get you some water. Yeah. At that time, I was talking about SAS, Dr. Sylvia Hill, and the Southern Africa Support Project. And they did enormous work, wonderful work, coming out of the 6th Pan-African Congress. Right. Yeah, she was one of the organizers for Six-Pack. And my daughter was born that year, and I didn't get a chance to go. I had to make a decision. My husband went, but I didn't go. Yeah. I didn't go.
I want to ask you a little bit about African Liberation Day. There were so many, rallies and marches here in DC, almost on an annual basis, every other year, and they would gather in what used to be Meridian Park. We changed the name to Malcolm X Park. You had a major role in that. Talk about that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it was more, I don't recall the real genesis. I can't say if it was more SNCC or more New School or what, but I was an active organizer, and Stokely picked it up, and we physically had a naming ceremony. We went to, right across the street from it was the Ghanaian embassy, and while it was a little awkward politically, we asked them to allow us to use the embassy to make the announcement of a change of name and to garner it for the community, that it now was the community's park. And it would be called Malcolm X Park from here on. And I did the press conference, and Brother Wusu Sadoki,
Malcolm X Liberation University.
Malcolm X Liberation University stood with me. The two of us did the did the naming ceremony.
I was there, I remember. Yeah.
And it was
Powerful.
wonderful
It was
because our
wonderful.
position is that this is our community, we live in it. Why can't the things in the community, the things that happen in the community, reflect the people who live here, their aspirations, and they have a part in doing it. When the WPFW came to town, Lauren Cresslove was talking to me about it. She was involved. And she says, Koko, you ought to come down. I said, I will. And she and I decorated a studio, put up walls, those padded walls and stuff, because we felt, and I know I strongly did and still do, that the community has to be a part of itself, of lifting itself, as well as when they are tearing it down, which is not positive.
Talk a little bit about your involvement in Pan-Africanism and the concept of Pan-Africanism, and you mentioned, you know, your activities related to the conference and the Free South Africa movement and all, but can you remember your, you know, the early
First
awareness of the whole Pan-African concept and movement?
I don't know that I can remember the beginning of it, because certainly when I got to Howard, it was like you couldn't escape the black consciousness. Even though I grew up in an all-black community, as I said, you never saw white people, or just on some occasions. It was a different feeling getting, I guess because now I'm a young woman, and I have to make my own decisions and choose to go, not to go, you know, that kind of thing. But working hard for people who were less fortunate than you, doing something that I had been doing all along, on specific projects, you know, collecting clothes, collecting food, packing them up, and getting so involved with people talking about we are an African people. And even before Malcolm went to Mecca, we were saying this. We are an African people. Our history is of an African people, and our future will be that of an African people. And there were so many people. I ain't no African. I'm from North Carolina.
Nothing in Africa.
I ain't nothing in Africa. What did Malcolm tell you? Left your brain
in Africa. Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think those were the genesis. And then when I got to be involved in an organization like SNCC, that I know what really sealed it. I got to the United Nations, and I got to the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, and they embraced me through this Commission for Racial Justice. They embraced me and made me a part of their delegation. And through that, I had, what do you call it, ID.
Credentials,
I had credentials to go to any United Nations, anything. And I think my first United Nations project that I participated in was in Mozambique, I believe, for Zimbabwe and Mozambique. I forget it now, but the title in Southern Africa, and met Samora Machel. I was just so impressed. His wife, who of course was the current wife, Rasha, of Nelson Mandela, yes. She was so gracious. She had a big reception for all of us, and of course I wanted to single myself out and let them know about people in Washington D.C. who support them.
Supported them.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
right.
And I did, and as I said to someone recently, my girlfriend Vera, at that time the ambassador was Andrew Young, who is a United Church of Christ minister. And I said to Vera, we were boogalooing in Mozambique with Andy Young. She said, Friend, what? And I said, yeah. After President Samora Machel had the party, we were over in the, with the down group, and we were boogalooing. So I think that United Nations experience is what really concretized, as Stokely would say, the theory with the reality. Going through those African countries. I must have visited 20, 30 African countries, and on the front line of the ones that had war in those huge planes that were carrying supplies. I'll never forget, we went out of Nigeria to the country just above it, anyway, to take medical supplies. And I was in this C-30, whatever they call transport plane, that had nothing, it didn't have seats like fasten your seatbelt seats, all of that. It was just a military plane taking equipment. And I just couldn't believe that this was the reality of the world, and I was a part of it, and that going back to the supplies being sent, that we could affect it both with supplies, with our coming in solidarity with them, with our pledging that we know that we're an African people, and we know that the same people that colonized you colonized us. So when Africans come over here and they're told, don't go into the inner city, don't date black women because they carry butcher knives, they're told these things. And many of you who know African people who work places can ask them. They'll tell you that they were told to avoid certain areas, don't talk to certain people. And they tell us that the same people who told you that tell us stuff about you. You know, you stink, you fly, you swing from trees, you don't have bathrooms. And for people who don't know, they take that, and so then the continent doesn't meet because of these barriers. So I had a chance to not just knock those barriers down. I remember the first year of independence in Zimbabwe. I was working in the Ministry of Health, and at lunchtime you go to get your lunch, and you go to the little sandwich shop around the corner, and there are two lines, a white line and a black line. And Lord, they were pulling my Sister Koko. I walk up to the front. There's two people over there, and our line is out the door, around the corner, and there's two people in the white line. So I said, excuse me, what's going on? You know, Zimbabwe is free now. Sister Koko.
It was thinking.
Koko.
It was
that it was still there.
Thinking.
Yes.
Let me fast forward quickly because we're running out of time, but this is just so fascinating. But fast forward to the 21st century, you know, talk about how your involvement now over the last, 10 years or so in Prince George's County and Seat Pleasant and all, how your early Black Power, SNCC, Pan-African experiences influence what you do now and have been doing, recently in the community.
I'm glad you asked me that because when I came back from Africa, Zimbabwe, I got married to a continental African and had a wonderful son, Lamine Roy Endure, who is a fantastic person. Intelligent, he's a Brown graduate. He didn't go to Howard in economics, but he's also a third generation entrepreneur, and he's making his mark in the area. But when I got back, I got married, had Lamine, and I worked for the local
utility?
Yes, not the utility company, but the DC agency that's over the Office of People's Counsel.
Oh, the People's Counsel.
I worked in the Office of People's Counsel. Excuse me, y'all. At that time, Brian Lederer was the head of it, and the current head, the current counsel is Sandra Madabu Fry, who worked with me at that time. Very, very competent person. Anyway, I got a chance. In fact, the first project we worked on was the breakdown of the mom bell into the baby bells. And I was hired as a community person who would go out and explain, you know, if there's anything before DC legislators,
The council, the DC council.
trying to say, I'm sorry, I just get so wrapped up when I get excited.
Okay.
But the utility commissions.
Okay.
What is that called? I'm sorry.
I know what you're talking about. I
Okay,
can't think
when
of it
something
either.
comes before them, it's the Office of People's Counsel that help the community to understand what the issue is. You know, the most recent one was the buyout of Pepco.
And then the Washington Gas, too.
Yes,
They were bought out.
okay. So before that could happen, the people had to have an opportunity to play a part and to say whether they want it or not. And I was hired at that time as a person who holds community forums to let the people air their grievances, to explain what the issues on the table are, who's involved, what it means to you, what it means, blah, blah, blah. And at that time, it was the Ma Bell broken down to baby bells. That was very interesting. Judge Harold Green was the judge in that case. It was very interesting going through around the city, talking to people and answering their questions about it. So I felt myself, I just come back from Zimbabwe, of course, and I didn't know what I'd be doing, but when I landed there, I felt myself, I could just see, you know, this, it's the same everywhere. And if our people are not informed, and if our people don't get active, then people who don't always have our interests, they prevail.
Make the decisions
Yes,
for us.
yes.
Right.
And of course, not just make the decision for us, but somehow influence us to stay home, not to vote, or that your vote doesn't matter, or whatever. And it's not the case. It's not the case. But anyway, I came back. I worked for the Office of People's Counsel, and then as I said, got married. I had a baby, and I moved out of DC into the county, and that was such a change for me, because I was a DC girl, and such a change for me. And I got involved in Prince George County things, and I landed with an organization, a startup organization, that wanted to make a difference in their community, and they asked me to be an advisor, and I did, and of course I ended up being the chairperson. But when I moved away and came back, I stayed with them. I came every quarter. I came to my meetings and worked with them. But when I came back to the area, I became the director of it, and it was an organization that dealt with housing, and it was all happening leading up to the big housing debacle that we just had. But getting the community involved, getting the community to understand that nothing can happen without your say-so.
Right.
But enough of you have to say so.
Right.
Not just one of you or two of you. So which means we have to organize, we have to knock on doors, we have to go to churches, we have to talk to your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of reinvigorated me, because I had been away and out of it for a long time. I even moved back to Newport News. My dad got very ill to help him with his health, and we eventually moved him back to the area. And that's when I came back to the area as well. But knowing that everybody has a responsibility. Everybody has a responsibility to get involved in their community. If you don't like something that's going on, work to change it, because that's how it works.
And if you don't change it, it's not gonna.
It's not going to
happen.
That's
it's
right.
Not gonna happen.
Everybody.
I want to thank you, Koko, for this wonderful interview. If you had one piece of advice that you could give to the next generation of community activists, and what would it be?
Know yourself, and you can find yourself in service to your community.
Wonderful.
I don't know
Very
where that
good
came
advice. Excellent. Thank you so much, Koko. This has been a pleasure. Wonderful. You've been an inspiration for so many in the community, and your legacy will live on for years to come. All right.
You forgot to mention the influence that you gave to me when you were a student helping me with the Canadian tour I
Right,
took
right.
across
And,
Canada
yeah.
to all the universities.
Actually, it was Stokely that called me. I was at Cornell at the time, and Stokely called you and Ethel Mine, and he said, Faye, I need you to facilitate. They need to go. It was Halifax. You went to Halifax,
I
Nova
went,
Scotia.
uh-huh.
And, yeah.
Yeah, Halifax,
remember.
Nova Scotia,
Yeah.
Toronto,
Right.
the whole suite. I
Yeah.
went to 5 universities.
Yeah, that was in '69 because I was at Cornell at the time. Yeah.
So it's people
Okay.
like you who support us, and we thank
Yeah.
you.
It's my pleasure. It's our role. So, thank you, Koko. Wonderful, wonderful, and very inspirational. Thank you
Okay.
so much. Okay.